The lights dimmed, the crowd held its breath, and in the space between two heartbeats, pop history changed forever. A young superstar stepped into the shadow of a living legend, and what happened next would echo across generations. That night, Britney Spears didn't just perform for Michael Jackson. She honored him in a way she would never forget. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another untold story. The stage was set for something extraordinary. The year was 2001. The occasion was the Michael Jackson 30th anniversary celebration, a monumental event honoring 3 decades of a career that had redefined music, dance, fashion, and the very idea of global superstardom. But beneath the glittering lights, behind the rehearsed smiles and perfectly timed cues, something deeper was unfolding, something that would leave an indelible mark on Britney Spears, the young artist who stood on the edge of her own legend, looking up at the man who had built the mountain she was now climbing. This was not just a tribute concert. This was a passing of the torch, whether spoken aloud or not. 2 generations of pop royalty were about to share the same stage, and in doing so, create one of the most iconic moments in entertainment history. Britney Spears had grown up watching Michael Jackson. She had studied his moves, absorbed his performances, memorized his songs, and dreamed, like millions of children around the world, of standing where he stood. But dreams rarely prepare you for reality. And that night, reality would exceed anything she could have imagined. The arena pulsed with anticipation. Fans from around the world filled the seats, their voices merging into a single hum of expectation. They were not just attending a concert, they were witnessing history. Michael Jackson's name alone carried a weight unlike any other. He was not merely a singer or a dancer. He was a phenomenon, a force of nature, a cultural earthquake whose aftershocks could still be felt decades after his first steps into the spotlight. For Britney Spears, this night was personal. She had been invited to perform as part of the tribute, a role that came with honor and pressure. The world already saw her as the Princess of Pop, the heir apparent to a throne built by Michael Jackson himself. But titles are fragile things. They must be earned, defended, and sometimes proven in the harshest spotlight imaginable. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric. Artists, producers, dancers, and technicians moved like clockwork, each playing their part in a production designed to celebrate greatness. But Britney was not just another performer in the lineup. She was about to step into a moment that would define her career and her relationship with the man who inspired it all. She adjusted her costume, checked her reflection, and took a breath that felt heavier than any she had ever taken before. This wasn't just about singing and dancing. This was about honoring Michael Jackson. This was about standing in front of her idol and offering a piece of her heart, her journey, her gratitude. And then the moment arrived. The lights shifted, the music began, the crowd roared. Britney Spears stepped onto the stage. She wasn't just performing a tribute, she was stepping into a conversation across generations. Every movement she made echoed the influence of Michael Jackson, his precision, his grace, his unmistakable command of the stage. But this wasn't imitation. This was homage. This was a student speaking to her master in the language they both understood best, performance. Her voice cut through the arena, strong yet trembling with emotion. Her body moved with confidence, yet beneath the choreography, there was something raw and vulnerable, a young woman standing in the presence of the man who had shaped her dreams. From the audience, Michael Jackson watched. He didn't just see a pop star performing one of his songs. He saw a reflection of his own journey, his own struggles, his own sacrifices. He saw the future of pop music standing before him, carrying the torch he had lit decades earlier. And then something happened that no one expected. As Britney's performance reached its peak, the energy in the room shifted. The crowd felt it, the performers felt it, and most importantly, Michael Jackson felt it. When the music faded and the applause erupted, Britney turned toward Michael. For a brief moment, The world seemed to stand still. Then he stood. Michael Jackson rose from his seat, his presence commanding even in silence. He began to walk toward the stage. The crowd gasped, then roared. Cameras flashed. Hearts raced. Britney froze, not out of fear but out of awe. This was not in the script. Michael Jackson stepped onto the stage. In that moment, the distance between legend and successor disappeared. There was no longer a king and a princess. There were simply two artists, standing face to face, connected by music, legacy, and something far deeper than fame. Michael approached Britney. And then he did something that would stay with her forever. He embraced her. It wasn't a quick, ceremonial hug. It wasn't a polite gesture for the cameras. It was a real, heartfelt embrace, the kind that says more than words ever could, the kind that carries gratitude, recognition, and unspoken understanding. Britney closed her eyes. She later said that in that moment the noise of the crowd disappeared. The lights faded. The cameras no longer mattered. All she could feel was the weight of his arms around her, the warmth of his presence, and the overwhelming realization that the man who had shaped her entire career was acknowledging her, not as a fan, not as a child, but as an artist. Michael Jackson whispered something to her. The microphones didn't catch it, the cameras couldn't hear it, but Britney would never forget it. Those words, spoken in that quiet space between two hearts, became something she carried with her long after the applause faded. And that is where the story truly begins. Because what the world saw that night was a powerful tribute performance. But what Britney experienced was something far deeper: validation, connection, and a moment of humanity from a man the world often saw as untouchable. To understand why this moment meant so much, we have to go back. Long before Britney Spears was a household name, long before the world crowned her the Princess of Pop, she was just a girl from Kentwood, Louisiana, standing in front of a television screen, watching Michael Jackson. She watched him glide across the stage with movements that seemed to defy gravity. She watched him command audiences with a single glance, a single note, a single step. She watched him transform music videos into cinematic experiences, songs into emotional journeys, concerts into global events. For Britney, Michael Jackson wasn't just an entertainer, he was a blueprint. She studied his work the way a painter studies masterpieces in a museum. She absorbed his discipline, his dedication, his attention to detail. She saw how he balanced vulnerability and power, how he could be both gentle and commanding, how he could tell stories through sound and movement in ways that words alone never could. And when Britney began her own journey into music, she carried Michael Jackson with her, not literally but spiritually. His influence lived in her performances, her music videos, her stage presence, her relentless pursuit of perfection. But inspiration is a one-way street until it is. Because that night, in 2001, the direction of that inspiration changed. Michael Jackson didn't just inspire Britney from afar, he acknowledged her. And in doing so, he changed her forever. In the days and years that followed the anniversary celebration, Britney would speak about that night with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and emotion. She would describe how surreal it felt to perform for Michael Jackson, how overwhelming it was to stand in front of him, knowing that everything she had built was, in some way, built on the foundation he had laid. But more than anything, she would talk about the hug. That hug became a symbol, a bridge between generations, a moment of connection between two artists whose paths had been shaped by the same industry, the same pressures, the same relentless spotlight. And for Britney, it became a reminder that even legends are human. Michael Jackson, despite his fame, his success, his global influence, had taken the time to acknowledge her effort, her respect, her tribute. He had met her not as a distant icon, but as a fellow artist. That mattered. Because behind the glitter and the headlines, Britney was navigating a world that was already beginning to show its darker side. The pressures of fame were mounting. The scrutiny was intensifying. The expectations were becoming suffocating. And in that moment, Michael Jackson, someone who had lived under the same microscope for decades, offered her something priceless: understanding. He didn't just see her performance, he saw her. And that is why Britney never forgot what Michael Jackson did that night. But the story doesn't end there. Because the impact of that moment extended far beyond a single hug on a brightly lit stage. It echoed through Britney's career, her struggles, her resilience, and her enduring connection to the man who had shaped pop culture in ways no one else ever had. To understand the depth of this connection, we have to understand Michael Jackson, not just as a performer but as a human being. Michael Jackson's journey was unlike any other. From the moment he stepped into the spotlight as a child, his life was no longer his own. Every move he made, every word he spoke, every decision he took was scrutinized, analyzed, and judged by a world that both adored and misunderstood him. He grew up under the weight of expectation, pressure, and fame, a combination that can crush even the strongest souls. Yet, through it all, he continued to create. He continued to innovate. He continued to push boundaries, not just in music, but in dance, fashion, storytelling, and global philanthropy. But greatness comes at a cost. Michael Jackson knew what it meant to be loved by millions and understood by few. He knew what it meant to stand on the highest peak of success and still feel isolated. He knew what it meant to give everything to the world and still feel like something was missing. And perhaps that is why he saw something of himself in Britney Spears. Because by 2001, Britney was already experiencing the early stages of the same journey. She was adored, celebrated, and criticized in equal measure. She was placed on a pedestal, then scrutinized for every step she took. She was praised for her talent, then reduced to headlines and controversies that often had little to do with her artistry. Michael recognized this. And that night, when he embraced her, he wasn't just congratulating her on a performance. He was, in many ways, welcoming her into a world he knew all too well. A world where fame is both a gift and a burden. A world where the applause can be deafening, yet the silence afterward can be unbearable. A world where you are never truly alone, yet often feel misunderstood. And in that moment, he offered her something rare in that world: genuine connection. Years later, Britney would reflect on her admiration for Michael Jackson not just as an artist, but as a person. She would speak about his kindness, his sensitivity, his vulnerability, qualities that were often overshadowed by his larger-than-life image. She would speak about how he understood the pressures she faced, how he empathized with her struggles, how he treated her with respect and compassion. And it all traced back to that night. But what the cameras didn't capture, what the headlines didn't report, what the world didn't see was the quiet aftermath of that moment. Backstage, after the applause faded and the lights dimmed, Britney and Michael spoke. Not as icons, not as headlines, but as two human beings navigating an industry that demanded everything from them. They talked about music, they talked about performance, they talked about the pressures of fame, they talked about the loneliness that often comes with success. And in those conversations, Britney found something she didn't even realize she was searching for: validation from someone who truly understood her world. Michael didn't offer advice in the traditional sense. He didn't lecture her or tell her how to live her life. He simply listened, he shared, he empathized. And that, for Britney, meant more than any award, any chart position, any headline. Because in an industry where so many voices tell you who you should be, what you should do, how you should act, having someone who simply sees you, without judgment, without agenda, is a rare gift. And that gift stayed with her. Even as her career reached new heights, even as her life became more complicated, even as the world's gaze grew harsher, Britney carried that moment with her like a quiet anchor. She never forgot what Michael Jackson did that night. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was historic, not because it was captured on camera, but because it was real. And real moments are the ones that last. As the years passed, both Britney Spears and Michael Jackson would face their own battles. Michael would continue to navigate the complexities of fame, scrutiny, and personal struggle. His life would become a series of headlines, controversies, triumphs, and tragedies, all unfolding under the relentless gaze of the world. Britney, too, would find herself at the center of a storm, one that would challenge her mental health, her autonomy, and her very identity. The pressures of fame, the invasions of privacy, the weight of expectation would take their toll, leading her into one of the most difficult periods of her life. And yet, through it all, the influence of Michael Jackson remained. Not just in her music, not just in her performances, but in her understanding of what it means to survive in a world that often consumes its stars. Because Michael Jackson wasn't just a mentor through his art. He became, in many ways, a symbol of both the heights and the costs of fame. And Britney understood that. She understood that greatness often comes with sacrifice. She understood that the same world that lifts you up can also tear you down. She understood that vulnerability is not weakness, but strength. And she understood that behind every legend is a human being who feels, struggles, hopes, and dreams. Michael Jackson taught her that, not through words alone, but through example. And that night in 2001, he taught her something else, that she was not alone. The world saw a king of pop and a princess of pop sharing a stage. Britney saw something more. She saw a man who had walked the path before her, reaching back to acknowledge her journey. She saw a mentor offering silent guidance. She saw a human being offering genuine connection. And she felt something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Recognition, respect, belonging. That moment, captured in a single embrace, became one of the most iconic images in pop culture history, not because of who they were, but because of what it represented. It represented the passing of a torch. It represented the continuity of artistry. It represented the idea that music is not just about fame or success, but about connection, inspiration, and shared humanity. And it represented the truth that even in an industry built on spectacle, the most powerful moments are often the quietest ones. But the story doesn't end there. Because Michael Jackson's legacy didn't fade with time, it grew. His influence continued to shape artists across generations, including Britney Spears, who carried his spirit into her own work. She continued to push boundaries, to redefine pop music, to challenge expectations, to tell her own story through sound and movement. And even as she faced her darkest moments, even as the world questioned her strength, even as she fought for her voice, the memory of that night remained, a reminder of who she was, where she came from, and what she was capable of. Michael Jackson's influence on Britney wasn't just artistic. It was emotional. It was psychological. It was human. And that is why she never forgot what he did that night. Because in an industry where moments are fleeting and attention is temporary, that moment was timeless. It wasn't about charts or awards or headlines. It was about connection. It was about respect. It was about understanding. And those things last far longer than fame. As we look back on that night now, with the perspective of time, it becomes clear that we weren't just witnessing a tribute performance. We were witnessing a conversation between generations. We were witnessing the evolution of pop music. We were witnessing the humanity behind the legends. And we were witnessing a moment that would shape the lives of both artists in ways the world would never fully see. Michael Jackson, the king of pop, stood at the pinnacle of his career, looking back on 3 decades of groundbreaking work. Britney Spears, the Princess of Pop, stood at the beginning of her own legacy, looking forward to a future filled with promise and uncertainty. And in that space between past and future, they met. Not as icons, not as headlines, but as artists, as humans, as souls connected by music. And that is why that night matters. Not just because it was historic, not just because it was iconic, but because it was real. And real moments are the ones that shape us. Britney Spears never forgot what Michael Jackson did that night. Because in a single embrace, he gave her something no award ever could. He gave her validation. He gave her understanding. He gave her connection. And in doing so, he gave her the strength to continue her journey, no matter how difficult it became. As the lights faded and the crowd dispersed, as the headlines were written and the footage replayed, as the world moved on to the next story, Britney carried that moment with her. Quietly, privately, forever. And now, years later, as we look back on that night, we are reminded of something essential. Behind every legend is a human being. Behind every performance is a story. Behind every moment is a connection. And sometimes, the most powerful moments in history are not the ones we expect, but the ones that happen quietly between two hearts, in the space between applause and silence. Michael Jackson didn't just inspire Britney Spears. He saw her, and she never forgot it. The story didn't stop with that embrace. In the years that followed, Britney Spears would find herself walking a path that felt eerily familiar, a path Michael Jackson had walked long before her. The applause grew louder, but so did the scrutiny. The fame grew brighter, but the shadows grew darker. And in those moments, whether consciously or not, she carried the memory of that night like a quiet compass, reminding her that survival in this world was not just about talent, but about resilience. Michael Jackson understood that better than anyone. He had lived under the microscope since childhood. Every movement, every expression, every silence had been dissected, misunderstood, and often weaponized against him. Yet he continued to create. He continued to love music. He continued to give to the world, even when the world seemed determined to take everything from him. And in that resilience, Britney saw something not just admirable, but necessary. There is a difference between admiration and understanding. Admiration looks from the outside in. Understanding lives from the inside out. And Michael Jackson didn't just admire Britney, he understood her. He understood what it felt like to grow up in front of cameras. He understood the pressure of being labeled a symbol instead of a person. He understood the loneliness that can exist even in a room full of applause. That understanding was not something he expressed in public speeches or grand gestures. It was expressed quietly, in private moments, in conversations that never made headlines, in a hug that the world would remember, but only Britney would fully feel. As Britney's career continued, she carried Michael Jackson's influence not only in her music, but in her mindset. She learned to respect the craft, to honor the audience, to treat the stage as sacred. She learned that performance was not about perfection, but about connection. And she learned that vulnerability, when paired with strength, could become a powerful force. But life would test those lessons. The mid-2000s brought a storm that few could have predicted. Britney's life became a spectacle. Her struggles became entertainment. Her pain became content. The world that once celebrated her now consumed her, dissected her, and judged her. And in that storm, Michael Jackson's story echoed louder than ever. He too had been misunderstood. He too had been sensationalized. He too had been reduced to headlines instead of humanity. And through it all, he had tried to protect his inner world, his creativity, his sense of self. Britney saw herself in him more clearly than ever. And perhaps in moments of darkness, she remembered that hug. Not the cameras, not the applause, but the human connection. Because when everything else fades, when fame becomes noise, when success becomes pressure, when the world becomes overwhelming, what remains are the moments of genuine understanding. The moments when someone sees you not as a symbol, but as a soul. Michael Jackson had given her that, and she never forgot it. As time passed, Michael's own journey reached its tragic conclusion. The world mourned the loss of a legend, a pioneer, a king. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Artists, fans, leaders, and dreamers all paused to reflect on what he had given to the world. But for Britney, the loss was not just public, it was personal. She wasn't just mourning an icon. She was mourning someone who had understood her, someone who had acknowledged her, someone who had reached across generations to say, without words, "I see you." In interviews and reflections, Britney would speak of Michael Jackson with reverence, emotion, and deep respect. She would call him one of her greatest inspirations, not just musically, but spiritually. She would speak of his kindness, his sensitivity, his humanity. And always, beneath those words, was the memory of that night. The night when two generations met. The night when a torch was passed. The night when a hug became a legacy. Because legacies are not built only on records sold or awards won. They are built on moments of impact, moments of connection, moments of humanity that ripple outward in ways we may never fully see. Michael Jackson's legacy lived on through Britney Spears, not just in sound and movement, but in resilience and understanding. And Britney's journey, in turn, became a testament to the complexity of fame, the cost of visibility, and the power of survival. In a world that often forgets the humanity of its stars, their story reminds us of something essential, that behind every spotlight is a person, behind every performance is a heart, and behind every legend is a story we may never fully know. But sometimes we are given a glimpse. Sometimes we are allowed to witness a moment that reveals the truth beneath the spectacle. That night in 2001 was one of those moments. It wasn't just about celebrating 30 years of Michael Jackson's career. It was about celebrating connection. It was about celebrating influence. It was about celebrating the invisible threads that tie generations together. And it was about celebrating the idea that music is not just entertainment. It is a language of the soul. Michael Jackson spoke that language fluently. Britney Spears learned it by heart. And in that embrace, they spoke it to each other. As the years continue to pass and new generations rise, the image of that moment remains, a reminder of what music can do, of what art can mean, of what connection can create. It reminds us that legends are not just made by their achievements, but by their humanity. It reminds us that inspiration is not a one-way street, but a living, breathing exchange. And it reminds us that sometimes, the most powerful moments in history are not the loudest ones, but the quietest ones. A hug, a whisper, a recognition, a passing of the torch. Britney Spears never forgot what Michael Jackson did that night. Because in a world of noise, he gave her silence. In a world of pressure, he gave her understanding. In a world of spectacle, he gave her humanity. And that is something no amount of time can erase. And even now, years later, the echo of that moment still lingers, not just in memory but in meaning. Because when history looks back on Britney Spears and Michael Jackson, it often does so through the lens of charts, controversies, and cultural impact. But beneath all of that, beneath the headlines and the noise, there exists a quieter truth, that two artists, separated by age but united by experience, once met in a moment that transcended performance and entered the realm of human connection. That night did not just change how Britney saw Michael Jackson. It changed how she saw herself. Before that stage, she was the student, the admirer, the young star chasing a legacy she had only seen from a distance. After that embrace, she was something more. She was acknowledged. She was recognized. She was, in that instant, no longer just following a path. She was walking alongside a legacy. And that realization mattered more than the world could ever know. Because in the years that followed, Britney would face moments when she felt invisible, unheard, and misunderstood. She would stand in courtrooms instead of concert halls. She would fight for autonomy instead of applause. She would struggle not for chart positions, but for her voice, her freedom, her identity. And in those moments, when the world felt cold and distant, the memory of that warm embrace stood in quiet contrast. Michael Jackson had once stood before her, not as a judge, not as a critic, not as an icon above her, but as a human being who understood her world. That memory became a form of emotional armor. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Because when someone who has walked the hardest road recognizes your journey, it becomes easier to keep walking. And Michael had walked one of the hardest roads imaginable. His life was a paradox of love and loneliness, adoration and isolation, brilliance and pain. He had experienced the highest highs and the lowest lows, often at the same time. And through it all, he had learned lessons that few could teach, lessons about resilience, vulnerability, and the cost of living in the spotlight. Those lessons were never written in books or spoken in lectures. They were lived. And when he embraced Britney, he passed those lessons on, not through words but through presence, through empathy, through understanding. That is why Britney never forgot what Michael Jackson did that night. Because he didn't just honor her performance. He honored her journey. He didn't just applaud her talent. He acknowledged her humanity. And in doing so, he gave her something no award or accolade ever could: the feeling of being seen by someone who truly understood. As time moved forward and the world continued to change, the image of that moment remained frozen in history, a snapshot of two eras colliding, two paths crossing, two souls connecting. But the impact of that moment was not frozen. It lived. It grew. It evolved. It became part of Britney's internal narrative, part of her understanding of herself, part of her resilience in the face of adversity. Because when you have been truly seen once, you never forget it. You carry it with you. You return to it in moments of doubt. You draw strength from it in moments of weakness. You remember it when the world tries to tell you who you are, and you need to remind yourself who you really are. Michael Jackson had given her that anchor. And anchors matter most in storms. As Britney's story continued to unfold, the world watched with a mixture of fascination, concern, and misunderstanding. Her struggles became public. Her battles became headlines. Her pain became spectacle. But behind the scenes, there was a woman trying to reclaim her voice, her agency, her life. And behind that woman, there was a memory, a moment of connection with someone who had once stood in her place, under the same glare, facing the same pressures. Michael Jackson's story had taught her that survival was possible, that endurance was real, that even when the world misunderstands you, you can still hold onto your truth. And that truth is not defined by headlines, but by heart. In many ways, Britney's journey became a continuation of Michael's story, not an outcome, but an essence. Both were artists who gave the world everything they had. Both were misunderstood by the world they entertained. Both were reduced to symbols when they were, in fact, human beings. And both carried a depth of emotion that was rarely acknowledged publicly. But that night in 2001, there was no misunderstanding. There was no reduction. There was only recognition. And that recognition became one of the most meaningful moments of Britney's life. It was not a career milestone. It was a human milestone, a moment when someone she admired not only acknowledged her work, but acknowledged her existence in a way that mattered. And that is why this story endures. Not because it is dramatic, not because it is sensational, but because it is human. Because in a world that often forgets the humanity of its stars, this moment reminds us that even legends seek connection, and even icons need understanding. Michael Jackson did not have to stand up. He did not have to walk onto that stage. He did not have to embrace Britney Spears. But he did. And in doing so, he created a moment that transcended performance and entered the realm of memory, meaning, and legacy. A moment that Britney would carry with her for the rest of her life. A moment that continues to inspire those who hear the story. A moment that reminds us that behind every spotlight, there is a heart. Behind every legend, there is a soul. And behind every great story, there is a moment of truth. That night was one of those moments. And Britney Spears never forgot what Michael Jackson did that night. Because sometimes, one moment is enough to change how you see the world. Sometimes, one connection is enough to change how you see yourself. And sometimes, one embrace is enough to last a lifetime. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, so these powerful moments continue to live on through your support.